He never raised his voice, never slammed doors, never said something he'd regret. And at first, I thought that meant he was fine, that nothing could hurt him, that his silence was strength. But over time, I started to see something else behind that calm. Not peace, not indifference, but a kind of quiet pain. The kind that doesn't need to be loud to be real. He didn't suppress his anger because he didn't feel. It was because he didn't trust the world to hold his truth without turning it against him. He wasn't cold, he was composed. Even when I tested him, even when I said things that would have broken someone else, he didn't flinch, he didn't react. But behind his stillness, I noticed how his eyes would darken, how he'd go even quieter, how his breath would slow, not to calm me, but to keep himself from cracking. And that's when I started to understand this wasn't detachment. This was discipline. A kind of emotional self-control that looked like strength, but felt a lot like silent suffering. Most people think strength is loud, that it punches walls, snaps back, makes itself known. But he showed me a different kind of strength, one that absorbs pain without passing it on, one that doesn't need to win the argument to walk away with self-respect. And while the world applauded his calm, I began to wonder, what happens to all the anger he never lets out? Where does it go? Because I could feel it living inside him, not violently, but quietly, like a storm that had nowhere to land, so it folded into silence. He never once said, "You hurt me." He just got a little quieter, a little less available. He still smiled, still showed up, but something changed. And I didn't notice it at first, because I was looking for signs of rage, not withdrawal. But men like him don't explode. They disappear slowly, emotionally, internally. And if you're not paying attention, you'll miss it, until one day he's there but distant, close but unreachable. And you realize just because he never got angry doesn't mean you didn't break something inside him. There's a kind of pain that doesn't come with tears. It comes with restraint, with breath held too long, with thoughts that never get spoken. And he carried that kind of pain. You could see it in the way he'd pause before answering, like every word had to be weighed, like he was protecting you from him, or maybe from the version of himself he doesn't allow to surface. Because he learned long ago, when a man shows too much emotion, the world calls it weakness, so he buried it and loved me through silence. There were moments when I wished he would just yell, say something, anything, because at least then I'd know where he stood. But instead, he just goes still, like a lake that hides how deep it runs. And that silence, it wasn't peace, it was pressure. Pressure to hold it all together, to be the unshakable one, to not be the emotional man. And while the world admired his restraint, I started mourning what it cost him. Because I realized that silence isn't always strength. Sometimes it's where pain hides when it doesn't feel safe enough to speak. He didn't shut down because he didn't care. He shut down because he cared too much and didn't know what to do with the weight. I saw it in the way he'd clench his jaw when I spoke carelessly, in how his fingers curled slightly, not into fists, but into control. He was never violent, never reactive, but he was always carrying something just under the surface. And that made me wonder, how many times did I hurt him without knowing, not because he didn't feel, but because he never let the feeling become a fight. Most people think a man is fine if he doesn't cry, if he doesn't lash out, if he doesn't leave. But I saw what they didn't. I saw how tired he looked when he thought I wasn't watching, how he sat with his head in his hands when the room was finally quiet, and it broke me, because I realized he wasn't okay. He just made sure everyone else was. And that's the tragedy of the stoic man. He suffers silently, so others don't have to. Until one day he's empty, not because he gave too little, but because he gave everything without being asked how he was. There's something unbearable about seeing a man in pain who won't name it. You want to fix it, to reach in and pull it out of him. But he won't let you. Not because he's cold, but because he's conditioned. Conditioned to endure, not express, to analyze, not emote. And when I tried to talk to him, he'd just say, "I'm fine," not with a smile, but with resignation. Because for him, pain wasn't a conversation, it was a private burden, one he believed he had to carry alone, no matter how much it was quietly killing him. Eventually, I stopped trying to make him talk, not out of defeat, but out of respect, because I understood his silence wasn't a wall, it was a shield. Not from me, but from the world that told him his emotions were dangerous. And once I saw that, I stopped asking, "What's wrong?" and started asking, "Where does it hurt?" And though he never answered out loud, I began to feel it in his sighs, in his pauses, in the way he held me a little tighter after long days. He didn't speak pain. He translated it into presence. Sometimes I wondered how long he'd been holding it all in before us, because his silence felt practiced, like a routine he'd memorized, like someone who learned too young that expressing hurt meant losing control. And so he built his identity around composure, around being the calm one. But calm doesn't mean unfeeling, and the more I watched him stay steady through things that would shake anyone else, the more I realized he wasn't numb, he was exhausted. From carrying everything and letting no one help him lift it. He was the kind of man who always asked how I was, but rarely let me ask the same. When I did, he'd deflect with a smile or a change of subject. He made care look effortless, but didn't know how to receive it. And that's the thing about men like him, they know how to show up for others, but not for themselves. They think love means protecting people from their darkness. And so he kept it locked away, even from me, especially from me, because deep down I think he feared that if I saw the full weight, I'd run. I remember a night when he was quiet, quieter than usual. I asked, "Are you okay?" He nodded. But his eyes didn't, his body didn't. The way he stared out the window told a different story. He wasn't angry, he wasn't sad. He was something deeper, worn, like someone who had been strong for too long. And in that moment, I realized that not all pain screams. Some of it just sits inside a man who's learned to look functional while breaking. And all I could do was sit with him in that quiet and not demand words he wasn't ready to give. He never needed fixing. He needed space. Space to feel without being forced to explain. Space to be soft without being labeled weak. I used to try to pull it out of him, his feelings, his fears. But over time, I learned that presence was more powerful than pressure. He didn't want a therapist, he wanted a witness. Someone to see him, not analyze him. And once I stopped trying to make him open up, something beautiful happened. He began to. Not all at once, not with tears, but with trust. And that trust meant more than any outburst ever could. What I learned from loving him was simple. Not every man who's quiet is detached. Some are just surviving, managing storms you'll never see. And if you're patient, if you stop needing every emotion to be spoken, you'll feel it. In how he shows up even when he's tired. In how he keeps promises even when he's hurting. His pain may be silent, but his love never was. It lived in his consistency, in his discipline, in the way he never let his internal battles spill onto me. That was his way of saying, "I'm hurting, but I won't hurt you." The world often praises men like him. Stoic, controlled, reliable, but they don't see the trade-off. They don't see the cost of never cracking, never breaking, never being held. He was the pillar everyone leaned on, but who did he lean on? No one. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. And I saw it most in his silence after we argued, not out of coldness, but because he didn't know where his pain would go if he let it out. He feared it would be too much, or worse, dismissed. He carried his wounds like a soldier, buried beneath armor, hidden behind routines. Wake up, work, protect, repeat. And for a long time I mistook that for emotional distance. But it was discipline. His pain didn't come out in shouting. It came out in sleepless nights, in the way his hands trembled when he thought no one noticed, in how tightly he'd hold me some nights without saying a word. It wasn't absence, it was effort. Quiet, painful effort to stay composed in a world that never asked him how he felt. There were days I wanted to shake him, to say, "You're allowed to break," but he didn't believe that. To him, breaking meant failure, weakness. So he kept holding it in, holding it all, like a man guarding something sacred. But what he didn't realize was that I didn't need his perfection. I needed his truth. I didn't want the man who had it all together. I wanted the man who trusted me enough to fall apart. But he'd been taught falling apart means losing control, and men like him would rather break in silence than risk being seen in pieces. Eventually, his silence started speaking louder than words ever could. It told me what he couldn't say, that he was tired, that he was hurting, that he didn't know how to ask for help without feeling like a burden. And maybe that's what broke me the most. Not that he was in pain, but that he didn't believe he was allowed to show it. That he thought his worth was tied to his strength. And I loved him so deeply, not despite his pain, but because of the way he carried it. With grace, with dignity, with unbearable quiet. One night I looked at him, not with questions, not with demands, but with presence. I didn't ask him to explain. I just sat there next to his silence and let it be enough. And slowly something shifted. His shoulders dropped, his breath deepened. He didn't cry, he didn't speak, but for once, he didn't hold it all alone. He let me hold a piece of it. And in that moment, I learned something I'll never forget sometimes. The most loving thing you can do for a man in pain is to stop asking him to express it and simply stay. After that night, I paid closer attention, not to his words, but to his silences. The way he lingered a little longer at the doorway before leaving for work. The sigh he let out when he thought I was asleep. The way his hands hesitated when reaching for mine, like he wasn't sure he deserved comfort. These weren't the signs of a man who didn't feel. They were the quiet alarms of someone who's been strong for too long. And once I tuned into that frequency, I couldn't unhear the ache he tried so hard to bury. He didn't want to talk about the past, about the people who hurt him, the betrayals he never saw coming, the dreams he quietly buried. But I saw them in fragments, in the way his body tensed when certain names came up, in how quickly he brushed off compliments, in how deeply he needed to be useful just to feel worthy. His pain wasn't loud, but it shaped everything: how he loved, how he worked, how he breathed. And loving him meant understanding that some wounds speak not in screams but in restraint. What struck me most wasn't how much he endured, but how little he believed he could share it. Somewhere along the way, he learned that to be a real man meant to carry everything alone, that to admit sadness was to invite shame. So he became silent, capable, unshakable, but even steel bends under enough pressure. And I wondered what would happen if he finally let go, if he realized he didn't have to be indestructible to be worthy. But I never forced it. I just tried to be the one place where his silence didn't have to be armor. Sometimes I think the world will never fully understand men like him. They'll call him stoic, emotionally unavailable, too serious. But I saw what was beneath that quiet. A heart that didn't know how to scream. A soul that felt safest in silence. And I'll never forget how he loved, not with grand gestures, but with reliability, with presence, with quiet acts of service. It wasn't that he didn't feel deeply, it's that he felt so much and never believed anyone would stay if they saw the full weight. So he loved from a distance. Even when he was near, he taught me that love isn't always loud, that sometimes it's in the way someone remembers your coffee order, or how they never let the gas tank hit empty. That real pain doesn't always show up in tears. Sometimes it hides behind perfect posture and steady hands, and that's strength. It isn't the absence of pain, it's choosing to love anyway. He never said I'm hurting, but every time he stayed present while breaking inside, he told me something louder even in my silence: I'm here, and I hope that's enough. And for me, it always was. As time passed, I began to understand his silence not as a void, but as a language of restraint, of respect, of deep emotion without demand. He didn't interrupt. He didn't explain. He allowed space for my storms, for my fears, for my healing. And only later did I realize the way he held that space for me was the same way he was begging silently for someone to hold space for him. Not to fix him, not to make him speak, but to simply stay close while he unraveled, without shame. He was the kind of man who wouldn't admit when he was in pain, but would carry your bags so you didn't feel yours. He'd stay up late fixing something he never complained about. He'd take the blame even when it wasn't his. That's how he expressed what he couldn't say. Through action, through protection. And that kind of love is easy to overlook until you no longer have it. Then you realize the man who never said I'm hurting was the one who hurt deepest, and never let it change how he loved you. Sometimes I resented his silence. I wanted fireworks, vulnerability, breakdowns I could soothe. But what I got was stillness, and now I see that was more intimate than any tear-filled monologue could have been. He let me near the places he never named. He trusted me with the quiet parts of him, even if he couldn't articulate them. And when someone shows you their pain not with words, but with presence, you learn that love isn't always about expression. Sometimes it's about endurance, silent, steady, sacred. He didn't need someone to fix him. He needed someone to believe him. To believe that even without dramatic emotion, his feelings were real. that even when he said I'm good, he wasn't always fine. I learned to read between the lines, the way he played the same song on repeat, the way he stayed awake longer than usual, the way he looked out the window a little too long. These were his confessions, and loving him meant honoring those small signals, not demanding louder ones, because real strength sometimes whispers. One day I asked him, "Why don't you ever let yourself fall apart?" He looked at me and said, "Because I've seen what happens when men do." And that broke me, not because he lacked emotion, but because the world taught him to fear his own. So he built himself like a fortress, solid, reliable, impenetrable. And while it kept him safe, it also kept him isolated. And now, whenever I think of him, I don't remember a man without feeling. I remember a man who felt too much and was never given permission to show it. There were moments I wanted to reach into his silence and pull the pain out myself, but I knew I couldn't, because his silence wasn't a cry for help, it was a boundary, a carefully constructed wall built from years of being told men, don't talk like that. So I didn't try to tear it down, I just sat at its base, consistently, quietly, and over time I saw him soften, not through confession but through comfort. He didn't need me to rescue him. He just needed me not to run when the quiet got heavy. The hardest part of loving him wasn't the silence. It was knowing he carried things he'd never share. I'd catch him staring into nothing, lost in some memory or thought he'd never name. And when I asked, he'd smile gently and change the subject. Not to hide from me, but to protect me from the weight, from the mess, from the version of him that he feared might be too much. And I wish he knew I never wanted perfection. I just wanted presence. The raw, unspoken, unfiltered version he never gave the world. He never needed to be strong for me, but he couldn't help it. He had survived too much to unlearn it quickly, so instead of asking him to unarm himself, I armed myself with patience. I stopped needing him to say I'm in pain and started listening to how he washed the dishes more aggressively after a hard day, how he took longer showers, how he answered I'm fine too quickly. These were his signals. And I loved him not by forcing him to open, but by showing him I was strong enough to sit in the dark with him without needing light. One evening, he held my hand tighter than usual, said nothing. Just sat there, his thumb moving slowly over mine. And I knew he was hurting, not because he said anything, but because that silence was full, heavy, real. That was his version of a scream, not volume, but presence. And I responded not with questions, but with a squeeze back. Because sometimes love isn't about getting someone to speak. It's about creating a silence safe enough for them to exist in, fully, wounded, quiet, and still feel held. Now, looking back, I realize he never needed permission to feel. He needed safety to reveal. And I'm proud I gave him that. Even if he never said the words, even if he never broke down, I saw him. I felt him. In the quiet spaces where most people stop listening. That's where his truth lived. And even though we don't speak now, I hope he remembers someone saw past the calm. Someone didn't need the explosion to believe the pain. Someone loved the man behind the silence and never asked him to be louder to be worthy. Sometimes I wonder how long he'll keep carrying that silence. How many more people will mistake his steadiness for emotional distance? Because unless you've sat close to him, close enough to feel what he doesn't say, you'll never understand. You'll think he's fine, that he doesn't feel as deeply. But I know better. I saw it in the tension in his shoulders, the long pauses before he responded, the way he'd exhale like he was setting something down, but only for a moment. That wasn't ease. That was exhaustion disguised as grace. He didn't leave pieces of himself behind in our fights. He didn't let anger tear through the room. But I sometimes wished he had, because what remained instead was this anxious silence so deep it felt sacred, but also isolating. He never weaponized his pain, never used it to guilt or manipulate. And yet that made it even harder, because I couldn't argue with him, couldn't blame him, couldn't fix what wasn't spoken. His restraint wasn't absence, it was reverence. But even reverence, when unshared, can become a form of loneliness. The world will never write songs about men like him. No heartbreak anthems, no dramatic scripts, because his pain wasn't poetic, it was practical. Grounded, he didn't self-destruct. He just carried it, moved forward, showed up, and that's exactly why I'll never forget him. Because it takes a different kind of courage to keep going when no one applauds your effort. to feel deeply and still choose discipline. He didn't love loudly, but he loved fully. And that fullness lingers in a way chaos never does. Even now, when I meet someone new, I find myself comparing their quiet to his. But it's never the same, because most people's silence is empty. His was full of history, hope, heartbreak he'd never name. And though I used to crave vulnerability in words, I now crave the kind of silence that has depth, that doesn't need explanation to feel real. He showed me that some men bleed inward, that some of the deepest emotions don't erupt, they settle, and they teach you how to sit with yourself even after the love is gone. If I could speak to him now, I wouldn't ask him to open up. I wouldn't beg for answers or confessions. I'd just say, I saw you, because that's what matters most. Not that he spoke, but that someone finally understood what his silence cost. He may never let it out, may never scream or cry or write it all down, but someone saw it, sat with it, didn't need it to be louder to believe it was real. That's the kind of love he deserved, and maybe in my quiet way I gave it to him, even if he never said thank you, even if he didn't know how. The older I get, the more I realize how rare men like him are. Not because they don't exist, but because the world doesn't make room for them. Sensitive but guarded, kind but wary, deeply emotional but disciplined enough to hide it. And so they become ghosts, present but misunderstood. They become the ones who carry others but never get carried. And it's only when they're gone that you realize how much they gave, how much they held in, and how sacred their silence truly was. He didn't ask to be understood, but he deserved to be. Sometimes silence isn't the absence of love, it's the weight of it. He didn't flood me with words. He didn't promise me forever. But he stayed when it was hard. He listened when I didn't make sense. He held me when I didn't know I needed it. And all that without ever asking for the same in return. That's what still gets me. He gave so much, quietly. And now, every time someone tries to prove their love with noise, I remember his. Steady, strong, but unforgettable. There are men who show you who they are through grand declarations. Then there are men who show you in the quiet, in the way they don't interrupt, in the way they remember the things you never said twice, in the way they make space for you to be, even when they're hurting themselves. That's who he was. And maybe that's why he slipped through my fingers. I was too busy waiting for a love that shouted, and didn't notice the one that stood still and stayed silent, waiting to be trusted. His silence wasn't emotional absence, it was emotional precision. He didn't speak to fill space. He spoke when it mattered. And when he didn't, that didn't mean he wasn't feeling. It meant he was processing, filtering, making sure what came out wouldn't wound. That kind of restraint is rare. It's love with integrity. It's pain held with grace. And if you've ever been loved by a man like that, you'll never confuse stillness with apathy again. You'll start to hear the language of silence and realize it says everything. Now, when I think of him, I don't hear words, I feel weight. The weight he carried, the weight he hid, the weight I didn't fully understand until much later. And though he never asked me to hold any of it, I wish I had offered more. More patience, more presence, fewer questions, fewer demands. Because in trying to make him speak, I missed the chance to simply witness him. And if I could go back, I wouldn't say much. I'd just sit beside him like he did for me so many times. Fully, without asking anything in return. There's something haunting about a love that never broke, but quietly faded. Not because it ran out of feeling, but because one of you couldn't carry the silence anymore. That's how it ended between us. No final fight, no crew. Just a slow drift between two people, one who needed more expression, and one who had only ever known suppression. I didn't stop loving him. I just stopped knowing how to reach him. And he didn't stop caring. He just didn't know how to let it show without unraveling everything he'd worked so hard to contain. Some men leave a trail of chaos behind them. He left quiet, and that's what echoes. Not noise, not drama, just absence. And in that absence, 100 unspoken things. I wonder if he ever wished I had listened more closely, if he hoped, in his own quiet way, that I'd noticed the things he couldn't bring himself to say. And maybe I did. Maybe I noticed too late. Because the truth is, you don't always lose someone because they stopped loving you. Sometimes you lose them because they didn't believe their pain had a place in your love. I see him now in small moments. in men who smile too quickly when you ask if they're okay, in the way someone laughs off a hard day with practiced ease, in friends who hold everything in so no one else has to feel heavy. And every time I think of him, of how he lived so close to his pain and so far from permission, he wasn't broken, he was uninvited from softness. And if you've ever loved someone like that, you learn to cherish silence differently, not as a gap, but as a language you must earn the right to understand. There are loves you grow through, loves that push you, stretch you, tear you open, and stitch you back together. But he wasn't that kind of love. He was the kind that held you steady while you unraveled. And that's what made his pain even harder to see, because he was always the strong one, always the calm. So when he began to dim, it looked like distance. But it was wariness, it was quiet heartbreak. And I wish I'd known, just because someone carries their sadness with dignity doesn't mean they don't need someone to hold it, too. If I could tell him one thing now, it would be this: I saw you. I didn't always understand, but I saw the effort, the held back words, the way you stayed solid even when you were crumbling inside. And I'm sorry for the times I mistook your silence for indifference, for the moments I needed you to be loud when you were already giving me everything you had left. You taught me the kind of love that doesn't need a spotlight, and I'll carry that with me every time I meet someone whose silence holds more truth than words ever could. Time passed, and I started to see his silence everywhere, in the way I now respond to conflict, in how I pause before speaking, in how I hold back just enough to feel in control. He left me with more than memories. He left me with a mirror, because somewhere along the way, I became like him, not because I wanted to, but because I finally understood how silence feels safer than exposure, how restraint feels like strength when vulnerability has been punished. And now I wonder if that was his way of protecting me from becoming him too soon. People say the loudest pain is the most dangerous, but I disagree. The pain he carried, the kind that never asked for help, never demanded attention, that pain can swallow a person whole. And it almost did, not in a dramatic way, but quietly, gradually. In how he stopped laughing from his chest, in how his touch became more thoughtful, like it was holding back emotion it didn't know how to release. He wasn't trying to be distant. He was trying to be safe, and in that effort, he became unreachable. Now, when others speak too much, explain too much, react too quickly, I flinch. Not because they're wrong, but because I've tasted the kind of love that moves slowly, silently. The kind that shows up in actions, not arguments. He taught me that sometimes the strongest men are the quietest. That pain doesn't always scream. It sometimes shows up in the way someone holds their breath during a conversation, or how they take the long route home just to collect themselves. He showed me how to see that, even when no one else does. There were nights when I wanted him to collapse into me, to confess, to finally say, I'm not okay. But he never did, and I had to learn to love him anyway. To accept that not every man has been taught the language of vulnerability. Some only know how to bleed internally, carefully, silently, always cleaning up before anyone notices. Loving him meant letting go of my expectations of emotional expression. It meant learning a new language, one made of glances, touch, and quiet loyalty, one that hurt and healed me all at once. The truth is, I don't resent him, I respect him. Because while the world demanded he be stoic, unshaken, always composed, he still showed up. Still gave love, even while carrying weight he never shared. That kind of man isn't weak, he's legendary. And though we didn't last, he shaped me, taught me how to listen better, love quieter, hold space instead of rushing in. And maybe that was his gift, not to stay, but to leave a kind of softness behind. The kind that reminds me even silence, when loved right, can speak forever. There's a kind of goodbye that doesn't need to be spoken. The kind that unfolds over time, like pages quietly turning themselves. That was our ending. No tears, no yelling, just a soft, mutual understanding that love wasn't enough, not because it lacked depth, but because it lacked language. I couldn't reach him, and he couldn't offer more, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. And sometimes love meets its limit not in absence, but in silence too full to cross. I still wonder if he ever lets anyone in. If someone ever sees the pain behind his quiet smile. Because I know it's still there, just better hidden now. Maybe someone will come along who won't need him to speak it, who can sit beside it like I tried to. Or maybe he'll carry it alone forever. Not because no one loves him, but because he believes love means not being a burden. That belief, it's the heaviest thing he'll ever hold, and no one can take it from him. Unless he finally decides to set it down. I don't romanticize our story. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was real and raw and quiet in a way that echoes louder than most love I've known. Because he didn't promise me everything. He didn't flood me with words. He offered me presence. And when that presence disappeared, I learned the hardest part about loving a man who doesn't show his pain isn't losing him. It's knowing he never believed he was allowed to be held while hurting. That kind of loss doesn't leave scars. It leaves silence where trust could have bloomed. If one day he reads this, if somehow these words ever reach him, I hope he knows he didn't fail me. He didn't need to be more expressive, more emotional, more open. He was exactly who he was supposed to be, and I loved that version of him, even when I didn't understand it. Especially when I didn't understand it. Because sometimes the most sacred love isn't the kind that changes someone. It's the kind that lets them be exactly as they are and chooses to love the quiet anyway. He may never speak his pain. The world may never hear his story, but I will always carry it with reverence. Because I saw it, I felt it, and even in its most silent form, it was beautiful, it was strong, it was love. Not loud, not obvious, but unshakable. And now, whenever I see a man go quiet, I don't assume he doesn't care. I wonder what he's carrying, and in that wondering, I honor the man who taught me to listen without needing words. The man who never yelled, but taught me everything about pain through his silence.